Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Welcome to another lively episode of City Talk. Today, we put the W back in webinar. As you saw, some of my colleagues tweeted today, we have an all-female panel to talk about advancing climate priorities as we recover or as we continue to live with and emerge from COVID. Really, really pleased to have everybody joining us and looking forward to a lively conversation here today. With people from coast to coast giving us their perspectives, and we, as I suggested, are very appreciative for people that take the time to come on these things. As I said, I'm Mary Rowe. I'm the president of the Canadian Urban Institute, and we are a coast-to-coast organization that's built about building connective tissue. How do we, all of us, engaged in urban life and engaged in making cities, how do we learn from each other? How do we share approaches? How do we adapt quickly? And how can we actually strengthen the kind of horizontal relationship in Canada from at a peer level? And we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people coming in to participate with us on the platforms we've been building since COVID. One was citywatchcanada.ca, a second citysharecanada.ca, and now we have citytalkcanada.ca. And these are being staffed and resourced and watched and shared by partner organizations and volunteers across the country. If you have bandwidth in your daily life to be able to watch a city, share some interesting things that you're seeing happening around you in civil society or other kinds of responses, if you want to help us build these City Talk sessions, we'd be delighted to have you. Please email us at covidresponse@canurb.org, covidresponse@canurb.org. Have we got a task for you? And we would be delighted to continue to welcome new folks to helping us in this remarkable collective exercise in community resilience. We've had several of these sessions called Candid Conversations, and I know this one will live up to that billing. It's going to be candid. We in Toronto originate these broadcasts from the City of Toronto, but we have partners from across the country, but we always acknowledge that Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis from across Turtle Island. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13, which was signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, which were signed with a number of Anishinaabeg nations. And we appreciate the legacy and the challenge that remains for us in truly reconciling ourselves to how these communities were settled, at what cost, to whom, and how do we continue to try to do this better. I said to someone on a call this morning, that to my colleagues actually on a staff call, that I feel for urbanists, COVID has been this remarkable wake-up call. All the things that pre-existed before COVID have now been just ripped asunder. It's all very clear to us the ways in which urbanism was not working for lots of folks, and it was not working for lots of issues, including the one we're here to talk about today. And I feel like we're at a point now, as awake, woke urbanists, that there's no more excuses. We have to figure out how do we emerge from this in a better way, in a stronger way. These talks are designed to provide meaning and reflection and a place to explore what the implications are right now and what do we anticipate that means. How does that inform our moving forward? So we ask all of our panelists coming on City Talk to ground themselves in what they're seeing and what's real, what's actually happening, what's working, what isn't working, and what's next. We do this fully aware that there are thousands and thousands of Canadians who are continuing to serve on the front lines to keep people safe and healthy and save lives. And so these conversations are in no way designed to supplant that or replace that or even distract from that. And we're particularly conscious that so much pressure is on municipal governments and people who work in different municipal service settings. Lots of pressure continuing. This is really the beginning of a conversation. We always say we have these chats, but then we encourage people to continue to have the conversation, and you can use hashtag CityTalk. You can also go on our websites and you can see that we are posting these sessions after they're done. We post a transcript, we post some takeaways that some of our colleagues extract from the conversation. We post the actual videos. And we would encourage you to look at those. And we also have a chat function. Many of you will see that if you're familiar. We're all Zoom pros now. there's a chat function here. We would encourage participants to use the chat function and direct your comments. There's a little toggle switch at the bottom, and you can direct them not just to all panelists, direct them to all panelists and everyone. Because what we're finding is that people on the chat have ongoing conversations. They learn a ton from each other. They answer each other's questions. They put up links that are really valuable. And the other thing I always say is, unlike Vegas, what you put in that chat actually gets posted. So just keep that in mind. Whatever you post up there is there for eternity. The other thing is that we have folk coming on these webinars who have jobs, they have clients, they have affiliations, but we really encourage people here to speak as individuals so that they are talking to us from their own personal perspectives about what they're seeing based on their particular vocation and experience and expertise. But we're not in any way asking them to bind their institution or their clients or whoever they're representing. We appreciate that you're off the hook. You can talk to us about what you think and what you think is really matters. So we're also fortunate that these City Talk sessions, as I suggested, are often partnered. We had a partnered event yesterday, which went off very, very well. And I did sneak on to watch a bit of it at the beginning. I got the day off because it wasn't back my birthday. Thank you, Lisa, for making that clear that I could take the day off. So I did. And today is a partnered session also with WSP, and that's Elliot Capel, who's on the CUI board and has been providing remarkable leadership to us as we've been shaping up City Talk, and he helped coordinate and program the Tuesday session and today's session on climate. So we're very appreciative to Elliot and his personal commitment and leadership with us, and to the support of his company, WSP. So we've got 4 fabulous women, coast to coast, to talk to us about what they think the opportunities are or the priorities should be as we emerge into the new normal. We had a session a couple of weeks ago on the 2 emergencies, the climate emergency and the COVID emergency, and how they were fusing. And now I'm hoping what we're going to hear a little bit about is, what do you think the implications should be, can be, for making climate the priority as we emerge? And we have 4 folks who bring different perspectives, different expertise to this. And as we often do, we're going to start with the furthest to the west, because we want to reward those people that had to get up and start with their morning coffee with us as opposed to lunch, which is what it is here in central Canada. And then we'll go to the east, where I suspect you're almost on your 2nd cup of tea in the afternoon. But let's first go to Deborah Harford, who is speaking to us from, I'm assuming you're in Vancouver, Deborah, are you? Is that where you are today? So yes, tell us what you're seeing and what you think, what's your observation as the practitioner that you are from that vantage point?
Well, I think that COVID has highlighted vulnerabilities that had already been highlighted in climate change adaptation activities, like hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessments. It's just really starkly brought those fault lines in our communities to the fore. And it's also highlighted how cities are the backbone of society and business in Canada, and keeping those critical systems and services running has meant that we've all been able to survive through this. Just as leadership that's respecting science and has actually affected how many people are surviving. But we face huge challenge now for municipal finance, which was again something that had been identified in the burden of adaptation. There's a disproportionate burden on cities. We can't just build back from this, we've got to build back better. And we need to find options that provide win-win-win. So we've got to look at not knee-jerk spending, but co-beneficial spending that helps us build our resilience to future climate impacts, reduce emissions, and benefit social equity, ecosystem health, etc. Because right now, our local economies that are being affected are now going to be facing cascading risks as we face wildfire, flood, etc., coming into the summer. That's already happening in Canada. People are already having to evacuate people because of extreme weather. In a lockdown, that's very, very difficult. So the connections are very, very clear. And, urban planning and this kind of thinking really holds the possibility for transformative benefits if we're careful and strategic about how we go forward from here.
Thank you. My sister works for the American Air Force, and she was telling us last night that now they've been doing relief services into New York City. She's in upstate New York, into New York City with healthcare challenges, but now they're having to redeploy in terms of lake rise on the Great Lakes and what the implications are. So as you say, there are these cascading challenges that are now going to compound where we're going. Okay, well next let's go into Ontario. Shoshanna, let's hear from you in Toronto. Shoshanna Saxe, please.
Thank you. So it's been interesting to watch the discussion about climate change and cities evolve over the, I guess, 7-8 weeks that we've been in the Canadian COVID shutdown. And one of the first conversations that people were having was, wow, this is so unprecedented. Everything changes. We don't know where we're sitting. We don't know where we're going. And that gives us an opportunity to rethink everything and start again. And on one hand, that's really optimistic in ways for climate change because it could shake us out of our sort of stale preconceived ways of doing things. But as the time has gone on, I've seen that cities are increasingly defaulting to their past assumptions, that we're increasingly seeing that the things we prioritized before are the things we're prioritizing again, and that already it's getting harder to move the needle on change. So some examples, there was a massive drop-off in traffic, which within the urbanist writing, both academic and non, lots of people were saying, this gives us an opportunity to see a new way forward, to do things differently from the way we've done them before, but we've already seen a rebound on traffic. And so the window is already closing, which is surprising because for something that felt earth-shattering as COVID did in March, it's surprising to see how quickly we're defaulting to our standard priorities. That said, there's a lot of really hopeful leadership, again, often from all the usual places. There's European cities saying, we're not going back to the way we were before, we're gonna make bike lanes permanent. We've seen that started in Vancouver and moved across Canada. We're starting to see action on that in Toronto, but similarly, a lot of the reticence we had before. And so what I'm seeing is that from an urbanist perspective, we're not getting as much change shaking out naturally from COVID as we might have thought in March, but that there is a window, I think a more narrow one than we might have hoped for, but definitely a real window to get in there and do really specific things. But that the things that will be most effective are things that can be fast and cheap. Because I think we need the things that are on the ground showing results quickly are the things that are starting to endure. So in the cities that are making bike lanes permanent, they started by having trial bike lanes. And as the window closes, some things that were on the table in March are no longer on the table.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I want to come back to that and talk about this, this notion, academics, you use it, Shoshanna, more professionally than I would, this notion that we regress to the mean, right?
Yeah.
There's something about that you default back, that there's that instinct. And in resilience talk, there used to be criticism of it because the suggestion was you want to build back better, when in fact a lot of the support programs, certainly where I was living in the US, would only allow you to build back to what was. So we'll come back to that, but let's talk about how do we actually emerge from this better. Chandra, let's go to you. I'm not sure actually physically where you are, but I know that your affiliation is a Niagara one, so you're in Ontario somewhere.
Yes, hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I represent the conservation authorities, and the one I represent is the Niagara Peninsula in the Niagara region. And as you know, the COVID crisis has been kind of contained and managed really well on the ground in Niagara region, I would say small communities. And the reason I see that happening is facts and science and how it's being communicated to people, and people are listening, they're taking action when they're seeing the facts and the science. And the other thing I'm noticing is amazing collaboration at all level of governments. So I think those are the kind of learnings that we can take forward, and it's working really well. What I've personally observed from my business perspective is the need for green infrastructure in our communities. We manage 41 parks in Niagara, and we own all this green space. It was so difficult for me personally in Niagara and all the other conservation authorities in Ontario to keep people away from these green spaces, to keep them inside their homes. And that kind of brought home a very important question of how we can keep people locally by evenly distributing green infrastructure and green space in our communities. So that was an important fact for me. The other thing we've seen in my region is impacts to local economy and local tourism and loss of green jobs. Because my region significantly, advanced in agriculture, and the economy is thriving based on regional tourism and actually international tourism, and we are seeing some impacts on that. And so whatever is done, I think it's all have to be integrated and kept in mind going forward as part of the recovery process. One interesting thing I will say I've noticed is that working from home has really worked. And for all of us, and it does work. If people don't believe in it, it does work. It helps with our transportation issue, and it has brought the greenhouse gas emissions significantly down. So what we can learn from that going forward, I think there has to be something. Small communities like Niagara, I think a lot of growth is coming in our region. So I can say that any recovery effort, like Deb said, has to have co-benefits, and it has to be integrated. We need to look at water, green space, and public health outcomes. They all need to be integrated, and that's what we need to see going forward. As we grow in small communities in our cities, I think we need to provide cities lungs to breathe and sponges to absorb water if we are going to develop resiliency and capacity to cope going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Chandra. You've raised a whole bunch of things that I think are going to be somewhat controversial. I'm not sure everybody's going to agree with you that working from home is working. It may be working for some people, but not for others. And also this notion of when you suggested this challenge about keeping people away from shared space. And what do those implications mean? So I want to come back to, and those of you in the chat, I see Andrew Thompson's already responding to the notion of the working from home. Let's come back to that. I want to now get Mel in to talk to us a little bit about what she's seeing on the East Coast in Halifax. So Mel, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, and then we'll pick up a bunch of threads and have a go. Okay, Mel, go.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I think cities across Canada are clearly being constrained. Budgets are being cut. Capital expenditures are either being pushed down the road or being used for operational expenditures, and it's really tough. Cities are right at the front lines of the climate crisis and, of course, this COVID crisis. Citizens rely heavily upon cities to provide services to them, and those services are really, really being stretched right now. And it's very difficult. A lot of their resources are being taken away. And that's very tough, and it potentially has some long-term impact for how we come out of this. I've been having some conversations with a few people too, and I think one of the difficult things that they're facing as well is essentially getting ready for any stimulus that is going to come. There seems to be pretty decent messaging at this point that we're looking for shovel-ready infrastructure and projects. On the climate side, we're not quite there yet. I think certain cities are further ahead than others, those who've had the benefit of having climate plans and strategies in place for a number of years or months. And if they do have shovel-ready, I think they will benefit extremely from this. My concern is that we might land up further exacerbating this infrastructure deficit for those who are not yet ready with their climate projects. So I think particularly during this time, it would be great to be able to see some of that stimulus spent on the strategy and the planning and the figuring it out. I think there are a lot of infrastructure projects that are going to come that are traditional, I would say, that we can put our climate lenses on top of. But certainly bigger climate types of projects that have significant co-benefits, for example, the retrofitting of residential homes across this country. They're complicated, they're not easy. If they were, we'd be doing them, and we're not. I don't know of any city in Canada who's succeeding in that. So spending some time now, before we get to the recovery, while we're still in the stabilization period of trying to think about how we can put those pieces together. The second thing I would say, building on what Deb had said, COVID has really essentially provided a magnifying glass for us to see the cracks that already existed in our urban systems. And certainly vulnerable populations being one of them. particularly here in Nova Scotia, you know, out of all the COVID deaths that we've experienced, a significant majority, almost 90% of them, have been in long-term care facilities. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, as we come out of that, the elderly are also a group that are going to be very exposed and vulnerable to climate change, as are the young, who are experiencing COVID also in a very different way. And so thinking about, as we move forward, how do we better use any recovery money and time to focus on those populations and achieve climate objectives at the same time?
I mean, it was interesting how the federal government this time, it's been so interesting to see the response, the financial response. Federal government identifies a bunch of challenges. It's being petitioned by a gazillion stakeholders. It says there's a group we have to try to support. They provide support, and then a couple weeks go by, and then they realize, oh, they've got to deliver that support a little differently than the way they originally planned it. And I was interested earlier this week when they came through with their loan support program for big business, that they were actually identifying some minimum some certain principles that those companies had to abide by. And one of them, as I recall, was consistent with the carbon tax, and that they were actually tying the money. So I think this is a question about what are the levers that are open to us actually as a society to compel the redevelopment to go in a certain kind of way. Shoshanna, you're the one that started this notion that we're defaulting to what we did before. And the shovel-ready concept is the same thing in essence. It's basically saying, if you've got things ready to go, then we can support them. The question is, those things that were ready to go, are they the right things?
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, I saw shovel-worthy flash up in the chat, and it's a conversation that's being had. There are environmental leaders from across the country writing letters. The C40 has stood up and said, we need the right kind of investment. And I think that conversation is really important. We have to hold two ideas in our mind at the same time when we're talking about stimulus. One is speed. Shovel-ready has traditionally been defined as things that can get going within 2 years, but often the government wants to get the money out fast. Yeah. Big new ideas can't get up to scale in 2 years. Infrastructure timelines are slow for big projects because they're complicated. You need to plan them, you need to do consultation. But there are a lot of things we can do in 2 years. And I think that to have things that are both shovel-ready, shovel-worthy, in line with our climate goals, point us to a better, more resilient future, instead of conceptualizing sort of New Deal big projects, what we need is a lot of smaller projects. So in cities, that can be bike infrastructure, it can be bus infrastructure, it can be helping refurbish the bridge that was downloaded onto the city 40 years ago they've never been able to afford but really need. Mm-hmm. It can be things like helping the construction industry of homes. The way we do stimulus to residential construction and the way we do stimulus to infrastructure construction are usually two separate types of money. One usually gets funded to municipalities and the other tends to be through tax incentives for individuals to take it up. What I think that this ties to something that Chandra is saying about the idea of, you know, we need more green space, we need more space, maybe we can work from home. That could be really positive, but there's also a dangerous undertone there of we all need to be farther apart from each other, we all have to have bigger homes, which is a reversion to the mean that is coming up a lot in the urban discussion. So which is really, really dangerous for climate change. In Ontario, at least, our two biggest problems for climate change are home energy, heating, and transportation, which are both related to how far apart we are and our land use habits. And so while we consider the stimulus and while we consider what to build next, we have to take very seriously that our instinct to spread out, to move apart from each other, that now feels in some way COVID incentivized, because if you have a yard and you have more green space and there's less people together, it feels like we'd be better off. I think we have to be very careful to think, yes, people need green space. Yes, people need air if they're going to isolate at home. How do we do that at the same time as not incentivizing the dominant land use patterns that have existed in our country and have failed us for 70 years?
Some of it, and don't you think some of it's anxiety too? It's the perception that's now getting embedded in us at a very individual unit level, that I don't want to be too close to anybody. So, and we've had lots of critiques on this platform about that there's really crummy density out there.
Yeah.
People are not safe, people are not able to, and they weren't safe before COVID. And you saw the pieces in the paper about this spike in domestic violence. So I think we have to, I hear you, Shoshanna, that we want to be in a situation where we're trying to advocate for the most environmentally responsible way of development, but how do we encourage safety and equity into that discourse? I want to just say that I'm not sure that the climate community's been that great at addressing this in the past.
I would agree, but there's just one thing I want to say on density, because I think we should be careful how we use that word. Density here is not the problem, it's crowding. And those are different things. And the idea that density has been dangerous for COVID is both false based on the data, and though pervasive, but it's also morally dangerous, because the impact of us believing that density, that people living together will hurt us, which is something that has existed in times of plague for a really long time. You know, the British aristocrats would run to their country seats, is not true, right? It has not been the densest neighborhoods that have been the sickest. Even in Ontario, you know, Pickering is doing a lot worse than Toronto.
Right.
So there's a lot of things going on here, but we just have to be capable of holding them in our mind at the same time, and not just because something feels true, that being in a city must be dangerous doesn't mean it is true.
Correct, but I guess part of what I think it's incumbent on us, all of us as urbanists, to do is to demonstrate how are we going to restore the public confidence that we can live in close proximity in a safe way and in an equitable way. I want to follow up with the question of big versus small. And again, I want to just take a poke at those of you that have been involved in this for so long, not that you're all old, but that this is a discourse that's been going for a couple of decades, right? And here we are in a crisis, and we're once again saying we've got to emerge and invest in climate policies. What about this? I do think there's been a preoccupation that it has to be a big plan with big investments. Is there a way to actually do what Shoshanna was asking and break this apart to a more granular, smaller investment? I'm wondering if Mel could actually comment on that, and then I'll go to Deb. But Mel, you're a practitioner. Can it be chunked down into doable things?
I think it needs to be, if we have any hope of getting it done. Quite frankly, I've been thinking a lot about home retrofits, mostly as a result of us coming home and being here and thinking about resilience starting at home. And also on the climate side, you know, our homes are one of the biggest carbon emitters in the country. Right. You know, there's 15 million of them. And we really need to think about how we address that. We're not going to be able to do that very, very quickly. And if we need to break it down into smaller pieces, I've been thinking about the recovery and the stimulus money, that if there's a way that we can really think about using it as seed financing in a way, you know, because we don't have the skills and the trades and, quite frankly, the army of labor we will need yet to do this type of work. And so I think if we think about this recovery time now almost as a pilot, really, to test these ideas, to have a little bit of financial forgiveness, so to speak, to figure out what works and what doesn't, and try it and do some homes and do some buildings. And over the course of time, we will learn, things will get cheaper, we will become much more efficient at doing that. And then it can become a big thing, and we can scale.
I mean, the world is in one big honkin' pilot right this minute.
That's right.
And it's illustrated to us that you can actually have an effect on GHGs and under extraordinary circumstance. Deb, let's go to you, because you started by suggesting that we need to work on co-benefits. Can that be, because co-benefits persuade people that it's the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, and I don't think we make those connections enough. So let's say we have a big move to electric vehicles. The reduced tailpipe emissions reduce health impacts during extreme heat. So When we're combining that with cities that are creating hundreds of miles of new bike lanes or pedestrian in streets like Seattle is right now, you get a huge health benefit that goes along with that, not just an emissions benefit, because we know that there will be some climate change, so there will be increasing heat, even if we stopped all our emissions right now today. And so it's making those connections. And I think there could be centralized national guidance for city investments that help people make those connections without being prescriptive. And that could be shared really widely. And it wouldn't require everyone to go out and hire consultants to do risk and vulnerability assessments. It's just to help people think about those connections. And you know, the point about natural assets and natural spaces is very much the same way. Even though provincial parks have been closed, the natural sites that we have, the parks, have been really crucial to people's health, whilst helping with stormwater management. So we've got to think about multi-purpose use sites that can, again, it's that win-win-win co-beneficial thinking. But I just want to add one other thing, which is that we're all talking about recovery. I don't think we're out of COVID yet. Like, we've got small cities in British Columbia that have seen absolute disappearance of tourists. All their small businesses are going out of business. Some of the federal stimulus is helping, but it's not. Some of them are really worried about going bankrupt. We've even got Vancouver mayor saying we're going bankrupt, and then he got hauled over the coals for that. But nevertheless, when you get the mayor of Vancouver saying that, what do you think is going to happen to all our small, I know this is the Urban Institute, but I assume we can talk about rural communities as well.
We let you, you're allowed to talk about.
I mean, they're the ones that most at risk of wildfire and flood as well. So they're literally talking about how do we just start focusing on local survival. And so, you know, that we've got to think about ways to help job stimulus, and, you know, those should be thought about in terms of getting people back to work while reducing environmental impact again. So, you know, retrofitting buildings is a really important one. Designing projects to prioritize walking and cycling, active transportation, investments in parks and green spaces. You know, these are all things that could actually be job creation, as well as stimulus.
Can I interrupt you and just ask a question about that piece for you? So job creation, you know, the dilemma is that I think when they want shovel-ready projects, traditionally, it's because there's a political window and they want it to happen within their mandate. I mean, I don't want to generalize, but that's often the case, right? Now we want things to happen quickly because the need is great. And of course, large-scale infrastructure is a way to get a lot of people back working. It does do that in a way that smaller investments don't necessarily. Is there a way to combine this imperative for people to be back working with doing smaller projects? Shoshanna, you want to come in and then I'll come back to Deb.
So it depends a little bit about what types of jobs have been lost. So we have this strange privilege of being able to look at a stimulus from just a decade ago. The last time we had a lot of infrastructure or construction stimulus to get people back to work. And in that stimulus, a lot of people had lost jobs in small home construction.
Yeah.
Those jobs are not transferable to heavy infrastructure. It's a different skill set. So you can't put people who work building homes back to work building subway lines and bridges immediately. So stimulus can be used to build things, but in many ways, the smaller projects, which require, you know, less extreme welding knowledge,
less technical skill, maybe.
Less technical skill are better set up to employ more people faster than really big projects. Really big projects are important. I'm a big lover of big infrastructure. But for things that we need to do in 2 years, for getting a lot of people to work, medium skill work can do a lot of smaller scale infrastructure. Painting bike lanes is an important skill, but it's a different skill than, you know, deep water welding.
Well, and I'm wondering, Chandra, I'm wondering if this fits with what you were suggesting. I mean, I think what you were getting at is that we generally have a scarcity of public space and green space, and you're a steward of a significant tract that you want to conserve, obviously. But do you see an opportunity for a kind of green jobs deployment that would pick up some of the amenity needs that we need to create more shared space, and it might in fact employ the kinds of have the kinds of skill sets that Shoshanna's referencing? Are the conservation authorities thinking about that at all?
Absolutely. All of the conservation authorities are thinking, how can we be part of this economic recovery? Because, you know, I would say this, the social economic value of protection of, you know, communities from flooding or green infrastructure has been severely underestimated. So many organizations, including Greenbelt, Pollution Probes, and others, you know, have tried to, and conservation authorities have tried to bring this to the forefront. I think a study, if I may recall, on green jobs estimated that the green infrastructure type of jobs in Ontario alone, there were 120,000 jobs in 2018. So you can imagine the extent of what's going on in communities in regards to these type of local activities and green infrastructure. I think if we start to link health outcomes to the environment and how our communities and neighborhoods are designed, we are going to achieve a lot. And this is the time to think about that, how we are smaller projects in local communities, how can we enhance our local neighborhood, because there will be a travel ban going forward, at least for an indefinite amount of time, or people will reduce their travel. So
you're echoing what Deb was just saying. I mean, you've got Niagara is a huge tourism district.
Well, this is what I'm saying.
And is there going to be any, right?
Yeah, how do we enhance all of that and keep people locally, at the same time providing them with mental health and social well-being benefits that they so badly need to avoid another mental health crisis? Yeah. So I think linking health and environment outcomes is so important. Green infrastructure, there's a lot to be enhanced. There's a lot to be promoted locally to keep people in. This is how it's going to be. And I think there are, if people come together, collaboration I mentioned, at different levels of governments as to what's needed in those local communities from a health perspective, infrastructure perspective, green space perspective, we can bring a whole bunch of local projects together and enhance our local communities for better outcomes going forward. And the whole concept of complete communities has never been so critical as it is now, looking at how we are going to flood-proof our homes and our communities, saving them from another disaster if there is flooding. How are we going to evenly and equally distribute green space, what our land use and build form will look like? Transportation, I talked about working from home, is working, yes, but it doesn't mean our homes have to be bigger and we have to consume more energy. It's about avoiding unnecessary travel. If you can work 2 days from home, you can go 3 days, no matter where you work, you're going to consume energy. It's the question of how we produce that energy, right? And how to bring
Chandra, you're in a tight spot here because you're advocating for a tourism region. And yet I think what you're suggesting is that tourism ultimately is part of the problem, because it's not necessary travel, right? We need to actually have a smaller footprint. So how do you reconcile those two tensions?
I think it's about balance. It's always about balance. It's local tourism versus regional tourism versus international. There has to be the right balance of everything. And we should be able to switch from one to other. Right now, in times of crisis, we're hurting economically. So what do you need to do locally to promote local tourism and bring that back up from an economic?
You mean not people traveling great distance, but actually locals. This is something that we're interested in. I'm going to go to Mel and then to you, Shoshanna. Mel, you talked earlier about how we need more time. We need more patience because doing green stuff actually requires plans, right? And my understanding is that of the federal infrastructure, the federal provincial municipal infrastructure program, that's a $33 billion investment that's been in play for the last couple of years, that the bucket that is least expanded is the green one, probably for the reasons you're suggesting. It's complicated, right?
It's complicated, and I think, ironically, in climate, we're running out of time. So we don't have that much time to figure this out. I think perhaps it's more about in order to get a lot of this type of funding, there is an incredible amount of red tape and a lot of stuff that cities have to get through. They basically have to show up with a complete feasibility study done, everything ready to go in order to get access to this funding. And I think that takes...
Who's red tape?
Federal funding packages. So either the ones that are currently existing or potentially the ones that might be coming.
It's federal fed tape. I'm trying to figure out whose red tape it is. Federal?
Government level, all orders of government. Right, and so to get to essentially meet the requirements of what they're looking for, that does take time. What I'm thinking, and it's time we don't really have, so during this process, is there a way by which we can expedite that by loosening the reins a little bit and saying, look, we don't have this perfectly figured out because we are in a pilot phase. We haven't been doing green infrastructure for 35 years the way we've been doing, wastewater treatment plants, for example. So let's give ourselves a little bit of room and freedom to figure that out and to make mistakes and learn from it and adapt as we go, rather than expecting that we're going to have it perfectly right now.
Yeah, do you think the public will tolerate that? I mean, I'm noticing that people are ready to throw the constraints about vaccine development out the windows and say, just get us a vaccine. Do you think we could ever see the same kind of public support for, okay, we're going to try to do this. We're going to try to move to a green investment plan?
I mean, I think if we can demonstrate the co-benefits of what the outcomes and the results of that would be, then absolutely yes. As a quick point, Canadians on an average annual basis spend about $60 billion a year renovating homes. Like, in the context of what we're already doing, why can't we be spending that $6 billion doing it in a way that's making our homes more resilient to climate and to things like this?
Yeah. Okay, Shoshanna, you've been waiting. Go for
it. We've done some research at U of T on what makes the projects we take on take a long time. And we all have this sense that building new things takes interminably long. It's very frustrating. And what we found was that it's not the red tape that's the problem. I'm sure red tape is frustrating. There are projects held up by it, but it's often an unwillingness to state and follow through on political priorities with funding. That we're often very nervous to do new things, and that there's a lot of pushback against them, both at the political level and at the community level. So some of the projects we studied, they're on the books for 40 years before they even really get started. Right. And then they have a year or two of red tape, but 40 years is a lot longer than 2 years. So one of the things that I'm hoping we can see coming out of COVID is an urgency from our leaders to take some risk. So I think, Mary, that goes to your question, will the populace tolerate it? I don't know. One advantage of we've been a little bit slow on climate change compared to the global leaders is that we can look at examples of other people doing things well. I don't think we need very many new ideas anymore. We can look to Scandinavian countries, we can look to German countries, we can even look to Albania, and we can copycat a lot of very good ideas and put them in place. And so that gives us hopefully some confidence that what we're doing isn't purely experimental, isn't purely out there. But in Canada, we've generally been very resistant to do that in the past. We usually don't want to do things unless there's a local example. It's like going for a job. What local experience do you have? I'm hoping that the global sense of we're all in this together, we're all looking for a global vaccine, the pressures and the jealousy of looking across to other places that are doing better than us could help us, give us some political cover, ambition, courage to try new things.
I mean, one of the things that we've seen during COVID is that local governments have been on the front lines. And so some of them have improvised in different kinds of ways. And there was no time for someone to tell them they couldn't do it. So they just did. And I'm interested whether or not, for instance, bike lanes, new access to streets, I think people saw that, and there seem to be examples. I think a lot of Canadians lament and say, well, why is it happening so much more quickly in other places? But this notion of slow streets, could we, as you're suggesting, cut ourselves some slack if it were done to try some things? A number of people here are work in smaller communities. Could some smaller communities try some things? And then if they work effectively, they then could get adopted by others. And I agree with you, Shoshanna. We tend to be a little, I don't know if we're jingoistic or what it is. We want to see a Canadian example. Oh, it wouldn't work. Scandinavia's not Canada, or Canada's not Scandinavia. I don't know. I have a question about dividends. There was talk before COVID about the resilience dividend, that there was going to be an opportunity to frame investment in the sense of this is what this will save you. There is a resilience dividend. Do you think we can imagine a situation where we'll be able to make the case that there's a COVID dividend, and that this crisis has put us in a situation where we can legitimately spend money in a particular kind of way that is greener, more sustainable, addresses climate change? How do we move the money? Deb.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that climate action was lagging on was real action on social equity and justice. And that has come to the fore in such a blinding way right now in the very clear low payment of essential workers, for instance, and then, people are at risk and vulnerable people being disproportionately affected. And so one of the dividends that could come out of this is real focus on place-based investment and community making for social resilience. Perhaps using, if there is stimulus money that can be used for this, building neighborhood networks that help reduce crime and increase the resilience of vulnerable people. A focus on affordable housing and as an economic stimulus to create jobs, but also provide people with better places to live and better health outcomes.
Can I stop you, Deb, on that? What would that look like? Because I'm interested in that too. I mean, this is part of what CUI is trying to work on, is the granular. We have a whole campaign called Bring Back Main Street, which is really about the granular. Mm-hmm. How do you package up that investment in a way that the public sector has the capacity to make that small a transaction, as opposed to billions of you know what I mean? Yeah, I mean,
I think that this goes back to this issue of criteria on funding, partly. So, I'm just going to go back to the infrastructure funding. I know it's very large scale, but I don't think it all has to be used for large scale, and it can be used for green. And we do have the Infrastructure Canada climate lens. This might be seen as more red tape by some, but it does require that emissions and resilience of projects are accounted for. I think the resilience is only required on projects over 10 million, which is too big in my opinion. I don't see why we just wouldn't have it for everything.
It's smaller.
But yeah. The fact is that is baked in as a sort of a gatekeeper on funding being given out. And I think we're seeing that with some of the other messaging coming from the federal government on its stimulus. But another way to bake that in, I don't think we've talked very much yet about the value of partnerships in cities, that we're talking about, yes, federal government can help the most, provincial governments should be helping as well. But look at all the value being provided by non-governmental organizations like this one, public-private partnerships, private actors, community groups. There's a huge amount going on that is, at that community level, that's providing an enormous amount of actually very valuable services and input that I don't think is being counted. And that probably will come to the fore in some of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Chandra, what do you think? I mean, can we, you're advocating, I think, I'm old enough to remember, well, I read about it, about the WPA in the US, which was a huge public investment program that created enormous public amenities, park systems, and all sorts of walking trails and things. And then I am old enough to remember in 1967, and you still in communities across the country will see something that was a centennial project. Do you think, Chandra, that your constituency can get the attention of the three levels of government to double down in investing in these kinds of green shared spaces? Can that be one of the COVID dividends, is that we're going to double down on investing those kinds of spaces? What do you think?
I think you just made a very good point, and we are trying our best. I hope the government listens to us. Any change and any recovery, I think we need to see some key transformational changes. And one of the easy one, it's the low-hanging fruit that pays big dividends, I think, is investment in our green infrastructure and green space. And we are working with the government. We're trying to influence that conversation, and I hope that is well understood. There are examples out there. Others have done it, like Shoshanna said. We don't need to go very far, and we can learn from those experiments and deploy some large-scale changes. The other learning or dividend, I would say, is that most vulnerable people and most vulnerable communities, in my understanding, got impacted the most because there was no capacity to cope. So I think as we rebuild, this resilience lens is so important, and resiliency is from all different aspects. Resiliency to cope, impacts of any future crisis like flooding or extreme weather, resilience to cope, extreme heat, resilience to cope with, social vulnerabilities. And we need to see the co-benefits, like Deb said, and these need to come together. And yes, we need to go from just quick wins of investing in large-scale projects to more granular scale of understanding how we can build these and invest in those communities. Together, it could be a huge impact. It's the cumulative impact, right?
Yeah, can I ask a general question of all of you? Would you put more money in local control to do this?
Yeah. Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
So just to, local governments own about 60% of Canada's infrastructure, and they get about 8 to 12 cents on the federal dollar, and 80% of that money goes to services, operations and maintenance. So less than 20% in cities is available for infrastructure. And I think we need, I'm going to go big here, but I think we need to overhaul the municipal financing. We need a new fiscal structure for municipalities. It's totally not, this was already, again, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the issues that are emerging through COVID had already been identified through climate change adaptation analysis. And I'm sure not just through that, but it's really just highlighting the fact that the way that municipalities make money currently is all related to development and property tax and transit, and those things are really seriously threatened. If COVID, as I said earlier, is not over, and we're looking at 18 months or more of problems, we're going to need not to raise, and so then we get into a what, we don't want to raise municipal taxes on people who don't have any money to pay them anymore, but we have to think about how municipalities are financed in a creative way. And I think a lot of this conversation has been about what can we do right now, but I think that this has to be a conversation that starts now and hopefully gets somewhere.
Can I say something controversial? Yeah. So I agree we shouldn't be raising municipal taxes on people who can't afford it anymore. But the last data I saw showed that less than 1% of white collar workers, high income workers, have yet seen changes in their income. And that may not be stable. I live in a city where it has been political kryptonite to raise taxes to the level of inflation for a very long time. I saw a number come around that said to plug Toronto's hole, the average homeowner's income tax would need to, property tax would need to go up just over $1,000. Please, yeah. Toronto, raise my property tax $1,000. And why is that not on the table? Yes, we need a better transfer. Yes, we need other things, but we also need to move away from some of these ideas that paying taxes for the things we want is bad. Paying taxes for the things we want is a privilege. It's how we build a society together. And I think if I go back to your question, Mary, about what are the dividends. I'm really hoping that we'll have more faith, more dedication to this civic contract, the idea that we can do things together and that there's a reason to do them and a benefit to them, which we've seen. I mean, all of this coming together around COVID. I hope that we can come together for COVID and for other things. And yes, I agree, we should not be raising taxes on people who can't afford it, but there really are people who can. And please, University of Toronto, I'd like to stay in that group. But it should be on the table.
I think what this is our all-female panel, and we've had one other, which was about municipal finance. We were joking about it. Oh, that's where women are. They care about how households function. How do we pay for things? And then what's the future? That's the women. That's the female lens. But I think one of the challenges, Shoshanna, with what you're suggesting is also that a property tax is an inelastic tax. It doesn't grow. So the question is, can we find a growth tax revenue streams so that as cities continue to grow, they have the capacity to cope with their growth? Mel, I think you were going to jump in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to say something about the dividend as well, not so much about taxes. I think, we've talked a lot about infrastructure stimulus. And to your point, Mary, yes, it's going to create jobs, but I think we need to be very cognizant of the jobs that it's going to create. As an all-woman panel, women have been significantly impacted by COVID. Infrastructure funding and infrastructure projects, the direct immediate impact is going to be mostly jobs for men. The long-term secondary, we will all benefit from that as citizens from whatever infrastructure gets built, but thinking through how we use that so that we can, benefit the job recovery of both men and women equally in a way. And secondary to that, we've also mostly spoken about infrastructure, but I'm really interested in our education system, in our health system. All of our kids have been sent home and parents are strapped dealing with this. There hasn't been a lot of discussion about that. And I think the long-term resilience dividend of our education system and our health systems in cities will pay themselves significantly over time, arguably even more than infrastructure.
We haven't got that much time left, gals, and I'm wondering if I could just go to each of you and just say, if you were to pick one thing that you in your life now, your work life, you're going to double down on as we continue, as was suggested by Deb. We're not through it. We all want to be through it, but we're probably not going to be through it. It's a new normal that we'll be living with for a long, long time. And you think of the one thing that you're going to focus on over the next 8 weeks, let's say. Just tell us in 30 seconds what it is. Let's go to you, Chandra, first. What's the one thing that you're going to focus on?
Well, I think my biggest focus is going to be equitable recovery as we go forward. And I'm already starting to think in my local area what needs to be done in terms of the green space that's available to people. So if we were to go another few months with social distancing, what innovations I can deploy in making that green space available to people. We've already opened up our parks. My sister conservation authorities are being very innovative with their trail systems to social distance people, trying technology. So I would focus on any technology that has come forward to make use of that, to make sure that people have access to green space and
in a safe way.
And that's our contribution to the local economy and this whole COVID crisis. Thank you.
And thinking local, getting all those local tourists to be local.
Yes, Niagara has lots to offer and will continue to boost that local economy, local tourism.
Right.
Yeah, 41 parks.
Right. Shoshanna, what's the one thing you're going to focus on?
Well, at the moment, I'm wondering if I'm local to Niagara.
Do you qualify as local?
Yeah.
Quality wine.
So I'm going to double down on, we need simple, good ideas, and we shouldn't be seduced by the sexy. There's lots of simple, good things that can be done quickly. I've been spending some research time over the last couple of years and also Twitter time over the last couple of weeks on bike lanes and reusing of urban public space. And I envision I'm going to keep honking that horn as much as I can.
Or ringing that bell. We need to find you a non-auto.
Ringing that bell, stomping my foot, shaking my fist. There's so much we can do with our street space, which makes up about 40% of our cities in North America, sometimes more. And that really doesn't have to be a place for, I think one of the greatest quotes I've seen for cars are private mobility comfort machines. It's public space. We can use it for public things. We can use it for place-based. And part of the reason we had to shut down all of our parks in Ontario is because we were afraid people would have nowhere else to go if we let them out of the house. Other countries with, like Germany, which had an epidemic worse than ours so far, did the opposite. They made more space, and that's what I would like to work on.
More space, right. Okay, let's go coast to coast. Let's hear first from you, Mel, in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, I think certainly looking and trying to find those opportunities where we really can realize those multiple benefits coming out of this, benefits that can address COVID, climate, and other health, socioeconomic equity issues. At the same time, however, being very cautious to ensure we don't lock ourselves into some bad decisions at the same time. To the point they made earlier, if we escape to the suburbs to deal with COVID, what does that mean when the next thing comes around? Right. Maybe the next pandemic requires us all to be in the same house together, or for us to live in very close quarters, right? So I'm being a little bit facetious here, but thinking through, locking ourselves, not locking into decisions, but doing them in a way that allows us some adaptability in the future, because we really, we won't know what's coming and we need to be able to adapt.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of resilience. We don't know what the next curveball is, right? Okay, last word to the West Coast, to you, Deb. What are you going to focus on for next 8 weeks?
You've planted the idea of the COVID dividend in my head. So we're going to be going back a little bit also to Shoshanna's comment about perhaps we're a little bit behind in Canada, but that actually gives us on climate action, but it gives us an opportunity to leap ahead in a, climate action was very siloed between adaptation and mitigation. We don't think it needs to be anymore. We're working on this concept of low carbon resilience. And so we're looking at leaping ahead with those smaller local governments with quite a strong focus on equity and how we proceed in a just way as people build back from COVID and try and plan how they're going to survive over the next year as the financial fallout takes place gradually. So yeah, hopefully, I think we'll get some really good lessons out of this, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today. Certainly learned a lot. It was really interesting.
It's been great to have you. I just want to repeat my little favorite hashtag no more excuses. I think this is our moment. This is our moment to come out of this and really take seriously the challenges in urban environments that we weren't able to address before effectively. We now have to. This has been a May Madness week for CUI. For some reason, we found ourselves hosting 5 of these this week, which is a couple more than we normally do. Normally we do 3. So this is number 4. Thank you very much, gals, for joining us. And you can see from the chat box, well, you can't see it yet, but you will see it, that there have been all sorts of interesting interactions there, and resources and debate and all sorts of good ideas. And I also just want to acknowledge that we have people who come onto these are not just from Canada, but they're from our neighbors to the south, lots of Americans and Europeans, and we always appreciate their perspectives and their interests because we are the Canadian Urban Institute. We obviously favor having Canadians on the platform, but we also appreciate that we have neighbors across the world that are tuning as well. So tomorrow, to finish off May Madness Week at CUI, I'm going to have a one-on-one with Mayor Crombie, Bonnie Crombie from Mississauga. She's going to talk to us about a lot of the issues that you gals touched on today, actually. What's the jurisdictional challenge? How do you lead a city as part of a region? How do you deal with decisions that are being made by others of government that actually profoundly affect the way you deliver your service and your priorities, and how your budget gets spent? She's been on the front lines of that. She's now embarking on it in an intense way as Ontario starts to think about what its reopening is going to look like. And once again, municipalities will be on the front lines holding all those responsibilities and not often the resources to do it. So we'll hear from Mayor Crombie tomorrow. And then we hope you all have a wonderful long weekend. It's going to be a different kind of long weekend, but you're going to hopefully go to your conservation authority that's near you, or your slow street that's near you. Or let's hope you're going to go and pay a visit to some and safely engage with a local shop owner who's been struggling and who is now starting to reemerge. And we appreciate you joining us for this. And on Tuesday, we will be back at it, City Talk. We're going to do a whole session on Bring Back Main Street. Watch your emails so that you get the notices of the 3 that are next week. Join us tomorrow with Mayor Crombie. Thanks again to WSP for sponsoring again, and to Elliot for his support. Thanks, everybody. It was really great to have you women. I'm really happy that you were able to come on. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mary.